boys back in '55, and that's when the name Ken Hansen came up, and this informant had said that he had shared a cell with Hansen, and Hansen had admitted to the crime, but they didn't really have any physical evidence other than one of the crime scene photos of one of the boys, when looked at a little closer, had actual imprints from saddle, and they were able to trace the numbers that were on this saddle to one of Silas Jane's horse farms where Ken Hansen had actually worked. So there was a link, so it did make sense. And Ken Hansen was tried once, and it didn't work, and then they tried him again. I think it was a hung jury, so they retried him and eventually got a criminal conviction. Hansen was already in prison for an arson that he had committed, so he was easy to find. But then he was eventually charged with the murder of the Schuessler-Peterson boys and then died in prison. I believe it was Pontiac, I think he was at. Well, because the name Ken Hansen came up, then everyone was like, oh, well, he probably did the Grimes sisters too. And so then Hansen kind of became a suspect, but it wasn't until 40 years after, the Grimes case that the name Ken Hansen ever came up.
Yeah, it's definitely weird that they had similar situations, but yeah, there are different facts of this one. And one of the things that I've never been able to figure out with any of the people involved is what was the motive, even for Melquist. Now, again, there was no evidence of rape or anything like that. Was there? It looked like maybe one of them had sex recently, but not rape.
Right. Well, I mean, I couldn't say exactly. They knew the older sister was sexually active because of stuff, the microscopic examination during the autopsy, but there was no sign of any forced sexual encounter. That could be. It could have been something from the day before. It could have been a consensual encounter that she had, before they went to the movie, or the day before, 2 days before. Although someone could have possibly had sex with them after they were unconscious, then there wouldn't really be any physical signs of rape, in that situation. Petey was not, so I tend to think that it was probably maybe a consensual encounter that happened before, only because chances are if one of the victims was raped, the other one would have been too, or, but there were no signs of any sort of sexual content with the younger girl. So even though Petey appeared to be older, Petey was younger, but she was taller than Barbara and more outgoing and not quite more of an extrovert than Barbara was. So my take on it would be if one of them was going to be, forcibly raped, then they wouldn't have stopped there, and both girls would have probably had some sort of evidence of sexual contact.
Yeah.
Blake, hop in, buddy. You sounded like you had something to say.
Oh, no, I was agreeing with Ray. And it's funny he brought that up about Ken Hansen, because years ago I had read about Helen Brock was Brock's candy. She was the heiress to that fortune. And when she went missing, everything got traced back to, Ken Hansen, and then of course back to Silas Jane. So it was weird, because Silas Jane was known for basically he would go through, and a lot of people were afraid of him, and he would do just about anything to make a dime. And he was known to be a real son of a bitch. So it was very easy for people to jump and say, oh, he probably did the Grimes sisters too, because as Ray said, he did have an unhealthy interest in young girls. So it did make a lot of sense. But it was weird to me that something else that I noticed, and I brought this up to Travis and Vic earlier, was the way that it was described of Prescott when he found the body. He mentioned it looked like a mannequin, and I so remember the person that found Elizabeth Short said the exact same thing. I just find that parallel very interesting, that both bodies were described as mannequins, and I guess because of the way the mottled complexion, because if you're frozen, then your blood doesn't have time. You're preserved for all intents and purposes. So I guess it just makes everything still look sort of flesh tone with maybe a little bit of a off crime.
Right.
But yeah, I don't know. And again, I'm not saying they weren't murdered. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying it's even with limited forensic technology like they had in 56 and 57, it seems clear that if they checked for poison, if they checked for drugs, if they checked for gunshots, and they checked for ligature marks, and they checked for poison, and then they also checked for rape and all this other kind of stuff, that I don't really know what led them to the decision that it was murder. And again, I'm not disputing anything that you're saying, Ray. I just find it one of those weird cases where it results in, well, I want to say it reminds me a lot of the Springfield Three. I don't know if you're familiar with them or not. They were three women, two girls that were 18 or 19, and then a mom of one of the girls who all disappeared in 1992 in Springfield, Massachusetts, and they never found any trace of any of them, and all their stuff was left behind in the house. Cigarettes, cars, jewelry, and purses and all, a dog and all that other kind of stuff. So it's just very strange to me that
Sure.
they never found those bodies. But in this case, they found the bodies, but there's no clear-cut sign that it was murder. Now, something I thought of was, as a crime writer and somebody that writes a lot of the horror fiction, I thought, well, what would it be like if you had somebody who took two girls and then had like a meat packing plant or worked someplace where he had access to a freezer, and he put them in there and tortured them? Because I know in one instance they found what appeared to be curdled milk in one of the girls' stomachs, and that was not something that she had eaten or ingested prior to the movie or at the movie. So I'm thinking if the person fed them a little or tortured them by just the cold, that would be possible for them to be murdered by cold, by just being tortured by, being exposed to extreme temperatures. But that was just something that was so uncommon then that you didn't really, as far as a form of murder, it was not something that was really widely on the former radar. Now anything's possible. I mean, the other day we had a guy come down here, 30 minutes from me, naked with an AR-15 and kill 4 people in a Waffle House where I go have breakfast. So I was like, well, okay, so now I don't discount anything. Now I think if there's somebody that's a serial freezer, for lack of a better term, I think that's plausible. But in the 50s, it just didn't seem like that was, I don't know how they got the basis for murder. And then also, like you said, with rape, even if the bodies were unconscious, I would think that my knowledge of the human body as far as rape and those kind of things go, there would still be sign of vaginal tearing or in some kind of a trauma consistent with forceful, even from what I understand from all the serial killers, Chikatilo and all the ones I've studied, that it was still possible for you to rape someone while they were unconscious and they would still show some signs of trauma, because it's not about sex for rapists, it's about domination and power.
About domination, right. So they're not doing it for no gratification anyway.
Right, so it just seems like there would still be some sign of trauma, but as you said, it was some seminal fluid, that was supposed to have been found in her vaginal fluids and all that kind of stuff. And then the other girl, there was nothing wrong with her. There was nothing to indicate that she had intercourse. So that stands to reason. I agree with you there. If it would have been a rape, then they would have done that to both of them versus just one. But it's one of those cases where you're just like, you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. And I kind of found this site interesting. I don't know if you know anything about it, Ray, but it's called let me see, Chicago Now, and this guy named Ray Johnson wrote this really awesome article about it. So I was kind of going over that today too while I was having lunch. I know I read weird shit when I eat, don't I? So I thought that was really cool that you had a really beautiful photo. It was really disturbing, but it was a very beautiful and well done photo of Loretta Grimes looking over the flyer with her daughters on it, and I love the article, and I really just I don't know what to think about this case, because there's just so many things that don't add up, and I'm sure you say the same thing, and then Travis and Vic, I'm sure, have said it too. There's so many people that are liked for this, but no one clear-cut thing. But the thing that I liked that I really would like you to go into, if you have the time, is when you met with the lady who was around them right at the time they disappeared, and the story of the voice that called Loretta Grimes. I think that was what we talk about.
Right, and that's one of those things with Melquist that I couldn't let go of, because there was Loretta Grimes after her girls were found, she received a lot of phone calls and letters, and a lot of, some of them were nice, but a lot of them were mean. And so she would get phone calls or letters from people saying, your girls deserved what they got. You're a terrible mom. You should never let them go to the theater that late. She did get a lot of, hate mail or whatnot. But there's one phone call that she said she would never forget. And this came out after, actually, Bonnie Lee Scott's body was found, but they didn't know who she was. In other words, it had just been discovered. They didn't know it was a 15-year-old girl. In fact, the police thought it was a nurse who had gone missing, or a journalist, I think, that had gone missing like 18 months ago. And so about 3 months after the Grimes girls were discovered murdered, Loretta gets a phone call. And the phone call, the caller says, I'm the one that undressed your girls. I know something about the little one that nobody else knows, that she has crossed toes. And then he laughed, and he hung up the phone. Now, that really stuck with her because Barbara did have crossed toes, and she was the little one. So even though she was the older one. So the caller wasn't specifically saying that it was the younger one. He said the little one, which Barbara was smaller than Petey, even though she was older. And so that really stuck with her. She said, I'll never forget this guy's voice. And it scared her because this person did know something that was never published in the paper, and even the police weren't made aware of it. I mean, obviously the coroner and that person would have been aware of it, but the general police investigating it really didn't center on that part of Barbara's anatomy. So whoever, was calling knew something about Barbara. Now, when Bonnie Lee Scott's body was found almost about 18 months later, Loretta received another phone call the day that it hit the paper that a body was found at 95th and LaGrange Road. Loretta received another phone call, and she said, I'm 100% positive that it's the same person who called me about my girls because I'll never forget his voice. And he said, I got away with murder again. I got away with another one. They're not going to be able to pin this on Benny Bedwell or Barry Cook. And then he laughed the same way he laughed before he hung up the phone 18 months ago. So basically, Loretta believed that whoever the killer of Bonnie Lee Scott was, because it came out later on that it was the body of Bonnie Lee Scott, was going to be the same person that murdered her girls. Now, the thing about Melquist is that he had an attorney very quickly. Well, actually, I shouldn't say very quickly. The police had him for 3 days before his attorney even got involved. But when his attorney got involved, they refused to let anyone talk to him about the Grimes case. So, and then I think they kind of more or less gave up on him after he took the 9 years for Bonnie Lee Scott. But Loretta, just believed it was the same guy who made both phone calls. And so you have to think, if the person called them in 57, early 57, specifically about her daughters, and then 18 months go by, who else would be watching the newspaper to see if another body shows up? And I'm sure there were lots of other murders around the same time. Why was it that case that she gets the other phone call on? And that's what made her think that it was the same exact person. And it turned out to be Charles Melquist who killed Bonnie Lee Scott. That was one thing that I can never let go on. Every time I looked at other suspects or looked at other people that could possibly be involved, I kept going back to that phone call. What about that phone call? There were marks on Patricia's chest. There were 3 puncture wounds on Petey's chest when they were found, which they couldn't, relate to anything. Initially, they thought they were rodent bites. Later on, they determined that they were actual puncture wounds. But they weren't deep enough to cause death. They were only about a half inch to 3/4 of an inch deep. But when they searched Melquist's car after the Bonnie Lee Scott case, they found a 3-pronged garden fork. that had the same basic layout as the 3 holes that were in Petey's chest.